Scarlett, a creepy hollow story. Written by Rachel Morgan. Narrated by Jessica Hazard. Chapter 1. She wore a red dress that night. Not carnelian red or wine red, but bright, brilliant red. Red that stood out in a crowd. Scarlet red. It wrapped snugly around her frame, accentuating her narrow waist, binding her legs together, and somehow producing a not insignificant amount of cleavage from her normally barely there chest. Beth had never worn anything like it. The money she saved from hours of scooping ice cream at Peppa's parlor after school normally went toward far more ordinary things. Miniature plants for her bedroom, school-appropriate clothing, and topping up the grocery bill, since Dad never gave her enough money when he sent her to the store every week. But tonight was a special occasion, and it warranted a special dress. A special dress she hoped Dad wouldn't force her to change out of. She couldn't decide whether he'd hate this dress or not. She knew he should hate it. Should hate his 16-year-old daughter wearing something so provocative. But it was more likely he wouldn't care enough to have an opinion. He'd never seen his daughter as more than a burdensome consequence of his accidental wanderings into a realm beyond his own. Beth styled her long, dark hair into voluminous curls, which she pinned back on one side and allowed to cascade over her other shoulder. She angled the wardrobe door and admired the effect in the tiny mirror stuck inside. A whistle broke the silence, and Beth threw a glance over her shoulder at the window. Barely an arm's length away, Zoe leaned on her own cracked, chipped window ledge. "Hot date tonight?" she asked with a grin. Haphazardly placed, like a child's building blocks tossed together in too small a space, the rundown houses on Miller Lane afforded their occupants little privacy. Good thing Beth and Zoe had been friends ever since Zoe moved in 5 years ago, poked her raven-black head into the space between their two houses, and complimented Beth on her miniature plant collection. "Don't pretend you know nothing about it," Beth said, returning Zoe's smile. "And I told you I'd be making a special effort for tonight. I only get a 1-year anniversary once." "Well, Jack is definitely going to notice your special effort. No doubt about that." Beth ducked her head as a blush heated her face. She'd always thought of herself as rather plain, the shy girl with brown hair and brown eyes. She'd inherited barely a shred of her mother's stunning beauty. But tonight, wearing this dress, she felt different. Tonight, she wouldn't be that plain girl. "Where's he taking you?" Zoe asked, as she picked at the flaking paint on her window ledge. Beth frowned. "I thought you'd know already." Zoe pasted an innocent look onto her face, but Beth stared her down. "Okay, fine," she said, slumping against the window frame. "I know everything. It's totally boring and you'll totally love it. And it's a complete waste of that gorgeous dress because no one else is going to see it." Beth smiled. "Sounds perfect." "I can't give away anything more." "You shouldn't have given away anything," Beth chided her. "But I won't tell Jack." "Thanks. He's been known to hurt me for giving his secrets away." "I know." Beth laughed as the memory of Jack chasing his sister around their tiny backyard with a pillow came to mind. "I'm surprised he tells you anything anymore." "He doesn't. But, sharing a house means I can't help accidentally discovering things." "Oh yes, I'm sure it's accidental." Beth reached for the silver chain hanging from the wardrobe doorknob. She fastened the clip behind her neck and looked into the mirror again. Delicate silver letters spelling the word Beth lay across her chest just below her throat. Lastly, she picked up an ornate silver ring with a large pearl sitting atop it, the one and only thing her mother had ever given her, and pushed it onto her left forefinger. "Okay, I think I'm ready." "You know that necklace is a bit too, childish for that dress, right?" "I know, but Jack gave it to me, and I love it." Yeah, Zoe sighed, then added, "Don't forget lipstick." "Oh, lipstick, right." Beth turned back to her wardrobe, but stopped. Darn, I completely forgot to get a color that matches the dress. Makeup had never been high on her priority list, and after purchasing the dress itself and checking that the simple black heels she kept aside for special occasions looked okay with the dress, she'd thought the outfit complete. "I've probably got something that'll work." Zoe disappeared from sight, and Beth could hear her rummaging through the contents of one of her drawers. "Got it. This should be close enough." She reappeared and tossed a small tube to Beth. Beth caught it easily, pulled the lid off, and stepped in front of her mirror once more. She applied the bright red color, pressed her lips together, and turned back to the window to give Zoe the most seductive pout she could summon without giggling. Zoe mimed fainting against the window frame before fanning herself. "Look at you sexy siren." Beth froze. The lipstick slipped from her fingers. I'm not a siren." Why would Zoe say that? She couldn't possibly know, could she? No. Zoe had no idea how true her words were. No idea of the world hiding just beyond her sight. "You okay?" Zoe asked, watching Beth closely. "Yes, just being clumsy." Beth dismissed the moment with a laugh she hoped sounded natural as she bent down, with great difficulty, given the tightness of the dress, and retrieved the lipstick. "I was joking, Beth," Zoe said as Beth straightened. "We all know you're not a temptress. I seriously don't expect you to seduce my brother and then, I don't know, eat him or whatever." That's not how it works," she wanted to say, but stopped herself. "That's so gross, Zoe," she said, adding in another laugh. "I know," Zoe shuddered. "I should not be using the words seduce and brother in the same sentence." "I was referring to the eating part." "Oh, yeah, that too." A bang sounded from the direction of Zoe's front porch. She looked over her shoulder, then said, "I think Jack just left." A nervous shiver ran down Beth's spine. "Are you sure I look okay?" She cast a final glance down at herself and felt odd all of a sudden. As if a buzzing coursed through her limbs and her head. A strange sort of dizziness. She'd felt it before, but it was starting to happen more often. She should probably visit a doctor. The moment passed, and she looked up once more. Through the window, Zoe stared at her with a frown. "What?" Beth asked. "Did I smudge my makeup?" "No." Zoe shook her head. "You just look really beautiful, that's all." Beth blew a kiss across the open space to her best friend. "Thanks, Zoe." She grabbed her purse and hurried downstairs as quickly as her heels allowed. Dad was slumped in his favorite chair in front of the TV. Based on the continuous stream of commentary, overlaying a dull roar of cheering and shouting, Beth guessed he was watching some form of sport. She didn't look closely enough to see which one. Instead, she kept her gaze focused on the front door as she walked past the living room. "Where are you going?" Dad called as she passed the door. "And what—" He sat up straighter as she leaned into the doorway to look at him. In a low voice, he asked, "What is that?" She knew what he was referring to. "It's a dress," she said, moving fully into the doorway and injecting her voice with as much confidence as she could muster. "And I'm going on a date with Jack." Instead of telling her to go back upstairs and change, Dad simply stared, his eyes slowly narrowing and his jaw clenching tightly. Beth placed a hand on her hip and stared defiantly back at him. For once in her life, she wouldn't back down. For once, she wouldn't feel guilty simply for existing. And then, that odd feeling of dizzy power vibrated through her once more, followed abruptly by a shock that zapped her arm like static electricity on a dry day. Ding dong! The shock was gone, and so was the vibration, and all Beth heard were 2 growled words leaving her father's lips. Get out. Chapter 2. Beth had always known her father didn't care much for her. She'd listened to her classmates whining about the anger and disappointment of their parents if any of them broke the rules at home, and she'd envied them, knowing that nothing could be worse than a parent who didn't care at all. But tonight, she'd discovered something worse. It was worse to know that her father hated her. She pushed aside the ache in her heart and rushed to the front door. She pulled it open, and there stood Jack, dressed in his smartest jacket, his dark hair buzzed short just the way it suited him, and his warm eyes smiling at her. Those eyes widened as he took her in. You look incredible. With her throat still too tight for her to utter a single word, she simply melted against him. His arms wrapped around her, secure and comforting. And just like that, her world was right again. Hey, what's wrong? He asked. Let's go. She reached back and pulled the door shut. Jack took her hand as they walked down the front steps. High above them, the sky was dark and menacing, with purple-black clouds rolling in. Beth probably should have brought a coat, but there was no way she was going back inside now. They reached Jack's car, more a patchwork collection of rusted pieces of metal than an actual vehicle, and he held the passenger door open for her. She didn't speak as they began driving, but Jack kept his hand resting on her knee, and that was enough to ease away the pain of that moment inside the house. By the time Jack pulled up near the lake, Dad's last words to her had receded to the far reaches of her memory, and the nervous excitement she'd felt while getting dressed coursed once more through her body. She'd been to the lake before, of course. She loved it here. The water calls to us. Unbidden, the distant memory of her mother's words rose to the surface of her mind. She dismissed them as she climbed from the car. As much as she might wish it in the secret depths of her heart, she was nothing like her mother. It wasn't only water and the untamed power of the ocean that she loved. Being anywhere outside made her happy. Fields, forests, mountains. Not that she often had the opportunity to spend time in nature. The dull and nearly dead town of Holton saw to that. But Jack had taken her hiking several times, driving hours and hours in search of hills and mountains, and they'd even visited the beach twice this past summer. The rest of the time, Beth made do with the lake on the outskirts of town. Jack had parked on the overgrown side, though, the side no one ever came to because too many tangled plants blocked the way to the water. She didn't question him, though. She trusted Jack. He came around to her side of the car and took her hand. You might have a little bit of trouble with those shoes, but I promise I won't let you trip. Then he led her, not away from the overgrown tangle of bushes and trees, but toward it. He pulled back one of the larger branches so she could duck beneath it. She saw then that a path had been cleared. "Did you do this?" she asked, looking back at him through the lattice of leaves and twigs. "Remember I said I was busy last week?" "Yes. I didn't see you the whole weekend." He stooped beneath the branch before letting it fall back into place behind him. He beamed at her. "Now you know where I was. Keep going," he added, urging her forward. Beth continued along the newly formed path, being careful to avoid the sharp edges where Jack must have hacked his way through the branches just days ago. After several more careful steps, she came to a clearing right beside the water. A picnic blanket lay upon the uneven grass, with a basket beside it and jars of candles all around. "This is that spot," she said in amazement, looking out across the water to the opposite shore. "That spot we always see from the other side but have never been able to get to." "Yes," Jack said. "Happy 1-year anniversary." As emotion tightened Beth's throat, making it difficult to speak, he hastily added, "It's not a fancy restaurant or anything, but I know you love the lake. And you've always wished you could find a way to this side, so I figured—" "It's amazing. I couldn't have asked for anything better." She had often wished she could run away and live in that other world, the world she'd been born for. But then she'd fallen in love with the boy next door. And now moments like this reminded her that she didn't need that other world after all. This world would do just fine. "It's just a little bit magical, isn't it?" Jack said, reaching for her hand. "Yes." Not the kind of magical she knew of, but as close to magical as anything could be in this world. They sat on the blanket and Beth kicked her shoes off, while Jack switched his phone to silent and left it by the picnic basket. Still feeling a little nervous, Beth began describing the miniature terrarium she'd constructed that morning, inside a hanging teardrop vase. Jack listened as he poured a drink for each of them. Sparkling grape juice, icy enough to send a shiver down her arms as she took a sip. "I'm sorry. I didn't expect it to be this cold tonight," Jack said, removing his jacket and placing it around Beth's shoulders. "It's okay. I have you to keep me warm." She put her cup down so she could push her arms into the sleeves of the jacket. If she'd been dressed like this when she left the house, Dad might not have been so furious. He might not have looked at her with such hatred. She pressed her lips together as she realized the cracks his words had caused in her heart were still there. Jack ran his fingers delicately through her hair and asked, "Do you want to tell me what's wrong?" She looked up, surprised. She'd meant to hide her sadness, but clearly she wasn't doing a very good job. "No, not now. I don't want to ruin tonight." "But if something's bothering you, then rather get it out. That way it won't bother you anymore and the night won't be ruined." She looked down at the blanket. "My dad." Jack nodded as if he'd known it was something to do with Dad. Of course he knew. Whenever something was wrong, it was almost always to do with the non-existent relationship between Beth and her father. "It's just something he said before I left. I've always known I mean nothing to him." "Don't say that." "But I was wrong. I mean less than nothing to him." "It doesn't matter," Jack said. And Beth was grateful he didn't try to contradict her. Didn't try to convince her that her father did, in fact, care. He knew it wasn't true just as much as she did. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss against her cheek. "You mean everything to me, my beautiful Scarlet lady," he whispered into her ear. "Scarlett," she whispered back, tasting the name on her tongue. "I like that. It sounds so exotic." "It does." He kissed her earlobe, then pulled back slightly. With one finger, he touched the silver name resting beneath her throat. "But I'm not sure it entirely fits the sweet girl I know you are inside." "Maybe I don't want to be that sweet girl all the time," she said, looking up at him between lashes painted dark with mascara. "Maybe tonight I want to be Scarlett." Scarlett. The name made her feel stronger, braver. It made her feel more like someone her mother would be pleased with, instead of the entirely ordinary girl she'd turned out to be. It made her feel like she could almost, possibly, be one of them. "Scarlett," Jack whispered, a fire igniting in his eyes as she held his gaze, daring him to see her as more than the sweet girl next door. And then the corners of his lips turned up, and she found a giggle escaping her lips just as Jack's face crumpled with amusement. They fell against each other, their laughter mingling together, and Beth felt that the cracks in her heart were almost healed. As their laughter subsided, she found herself on her back on the blanket, with Jack leaning over her, his smiling face close to hers. He kissed her neck, his fingers slid between hers, and when he looked at her again, his gaze was almost adoring. "It doesn't matter what name I call you," he said. "I'll always love you." A shiver raced across her skin, and at first she thought it was because of Jack's words and the way he was looking at her. But then she realized the strange feeling had returned. The vibration that hummed throughout her body, making her feel light and heavy at the same time. She wanted to make a mental note to stop putting it off and phone the doctor the next day. But there wasn't a single thought she could hold on to with Jack looking at her like that. As if nothing else existed in the world but her. "You are more beautiful tonight than you've ever been before," he whispered. His lips found hers and she pulled him closer. Her eyes slid closed. She forgot everything. Dad's angry words, the picnic blanket beneath her, the soft patter of rain that had begun to fall. All that mattered was Jack's body pressed against hers, his fingers sliding into her hair, his breaths becoming shallow as their kiss deepened. She dug her fingers into his back, feeling the muscles beneath his shirt, imagining his strength. As if with a great effort, Jack pulled his lips from hers and took a deep breath. Opening her eyes a fraction, she jokingly said, "Is this where you tell me I'm taking your breath away?" I can't." He pulled away from her embrace and clutched his chest. Alarmed, Beth sat up. "What's wrong?" Jack?" He tried to speak, but his shallow breaths had become gasps. He shook his head and clutched more desperately at his chest. He collapsed onto his side on the blanket. With icy fear shooting through her, Beth scrambled across the blanket and grabbed Jack's phone. She tapped the numbers with shaking fingers before returning to his side. "Breathe, okay? Just breathe." They were the most useless words she'd ever uttered. She saw the terror in his eyes as his horrible, rasping gasps became slower and slower. She wrapped her hand around his and squeezed it tight. His back arched and he let out a terrible, moaning gasp as a surge of power rushed through Beth's body. Shocked, frozen in place, her eyes moved to their clasped hands. Realization, slow and terrible and inevitable, coalesced into a single impossible thought. Siren. She snatched her hand away from Jack's and dropped the phone. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." "Your emergency?" came the disembodied voice from the phone. "Hello?" Jack's eyelids fluttered weakly. His chest barely rose and fell. Biting down on her shaking lip, Beth picked up the phone. She forced herself to speak, but her voice sounded far away as she named the lake and the area, before dropping the phone as if it burned. "I'm sorry," she whispered, inching slowly away from Jack. I'm sorry. Then she pushed herself to her feet and ran. Twigs slapped her arms and rain wet her face as she tore along the makeshift path. She cried out as the sharp edge of a branch sliced across her leg, but she didn't stop running. She kept going until she pushed past that final branch and stumbled out beside Jack's car. She reached for the door, but where would she go? Not home. Dad would cast her out if she'd truly become the thing he hated most. She had to leave, but the thought of being on her own terrified her. How would she survive? And Jack. What have I done? She whispered to the night. The wailing cry of an ambulance reached her ears. It wasn't far off. Of course it wasn't. Nothing ever happened in Holton. This was probably the first emergency all week. Beth looked down at her shaking hands. She stared at the ring. It was the only option left to her now. She gripped the pearl between her thumb and forefinger. She twisted it around 3 times. And the world vanished. Chapter 3. A whirlwind of color spun Beth around and around before dumping her onto a beach of warm sand, where she stumbled and fell to her knees. She stayed there, digging her fingers into the fine white sand, catching her breath and feeling the magic-infused air drift across her skin. Though a decade had passed since she was last here, she knew this was the right place. That almost imperceptible hum that existed in the sand, the water, even the air, was the same hum that now pulsed through her own body. A hum she had never noticed until she'd been sent to live in a world devoid of it. Beth clenched her fingers, watching a ripple of blue light dance through the sand, away from her hands and vanish as it reached the water. She scooped the sand up and let it sift between her fingers. As the grains hit the ground, they became crystals. White crystals that scattered around her knees, sparkling in the afternoon light, before disintegrating into sand once more. She stood and looked out across the water. The rays of the setting sun glittered like fiery orange gems upon the ocean's surface. Far beyond the breaking waves, where white foam became galloping horses that tumbled and vanished as they reached the shore. This world was alive in a way that other world, her father's world, could never be. And it was just as glorious in reality as it was in her dreams. But Jack... She squeezed her eyes shut as guilt tightened like a fist around her heart. But she couldn't think of him now. She couldn't go back until she was certain she'd never hurt him again. She opened her eyes and turned around. And there stood her mother, Eveline. Dazzling, fearsome, perfectly graceful. "Bessie?" Eveline said. And the terrified girl had to remind herself that she was only 5.5 the last time her mother saw her. That was the age at which Eveline sent Beth to live with her father. It was clear by then that she possessed no magic, and Eveline had no use for a daughter who was essentially human. "Bessie," her mother repeated, the questioning tone gone from her voice. Bessie. Beth had come to hate that name early on. After a week of being called Bessie the cow by her new human classmates, she'd informed her father, her teacher, and her classmates in an uncharacteristic show of confidence that they had made a mistake. Her name was not Bessie, but Beth. That confidence was nowhere to be found now. So instead of answering, Beth merely nodded. "You look awful," Eveline said. Beth looked down at the oversized jacket and the torn dress. Dirt smudged her feet and hands. She noticed, however, that her legs bore no scratches, and above the smeared dribble of blood where there should have been an open wound, only a narrow cut marred her skin. "Beneath all that mess, however," Eveline added, "you seem to have turned out rather lovely. Almost lovely enough to be one of us." She folded her arms over her chest. "What are you doing here? I told you there was only one reason you should ever return. I hope you haven't forgotten that." A spark of annoyance ignited Beth's terrified core, heating her chest and running down to her fingertips. This was her mother. Her own mother. Couldn't she at least pretend to be glad to see her daughter after all these years? Finally finding her voice, she said, "I haven't forgotten. That's why I'm here." Her mother tilted her head to the side. her gaze narrowing slightly. She looked around, seeming to search for something, before her gaze snapped back to Beth. "Is that you I'm sensing?" Beth hated the look of shock on Eveline's face, as if it were so impossible that her disappointment of a daughter might have turned out magical after all. She raised her chin, attempting to portray the self-assurance she wished she felt. I think so. I've been feeling different lately, and then tonight I was with someone, and when I touched him, it felt as though I'd sucked the energy out of his body and into mine. Eveline took a few steps toward Beth. Although step was a loose term, she seemed to glide more than walk, as an expression of wonder came over her face. "You're one of us after all. You truly are my daughter." A hesitant smile tugged the edges of Beth's lips as the tension eased from her chest. She'd been waiting her whole life to hear those words. Eveline moved closer and wrapped her arms briefly around Beth. It was barely a hug, just enough for Beth to feel her mother's hands press lightly against her back, and her sleek ebony hair tickle her cheek. And then it was over. But it was the most affection Beth could remember her mother ever showing her. "Come," Eveline said. "Let's go home." Beth remembered the rocks that led to the siren's home. She remembered standing atop them, staring out at the wild waters, wishing in her young heart that she could be everything her mother wanted her to be. Eveline traversed the rocks with practiced ease, while Beth trailed several steps behind her, slipping and stumbling and grasping onto the rocks. Wherever she placed her hand, the rough, weathered surface lit up, a different color each time, and she wondered if the rocks were now enchanted that way, or if it was her magic creating the light. The rocks hid a shallow pool that lapped upon the shores of a concealed beach. Beyond that, more rocks rose sharply, jutting out at odd angles and concealing the entrance to the siren's home. Eveline led Beth around the pool, beneath the archway carved into the stone, through a short tunnel, and then Beth was finally home. It was familiar and strange and beautiful all at once. Ahead of her was the vast oval-shaped garden she remembered playing in as a child. Fountains, pools, statues, and hedges created the perfect setting for a game of hide-and-seek. An open corridor of white marble, held up by pillars carved with exquisite detail, encircled the oval space. On the outer edge of the corridor, archways of greenery led to individual gardens and homes. It was toward one of these archways that Eveline was no doubt leading her. Whichever one was now her home, a young girl ran across their path, then stopped to lean against a pillar and stare at Beth. Beth looked away, feeling self-conscious in her oversized jacket and blood-smudged legs. She clasped her hands together and felt sand on her palms, although sand didn't quite feel like that, did it? Surprise jolted through her as she looked down and found glitter falling between her fingers. She lifted one arm and watched the glitter trail through the air behind her. "Bessie, dear, please try to control yourself," Eveline said. "You're radiating magic everywhere." "It's Beth." Eveline stopped abruptly, causing Beth to almost walk into her. She looked over her shoulder. "Excuse me?" Swallowing her unease, Beth said, "My name is Beth, not Bessie." Eveline's gaze shifted to the silver pendant resting at the base of Beth's neck. Her eyes, bright and dangerous and unforgiving, moved back up to meet Beth's. "Beth, dear," she repeated. "Control yourself. You're radiating magic
everywhere.
Everywhere. Beth thought back to the light glowing within the rocks, the sand turning to crystals, and the galloping seafoam horses. Were those all products of the magic she had no control over? Bessie? Is that you? Beth slowed and threw a look over her shoulder. A girl with long, shimmering copper locks stood there watching her. A memory of two little girls running along the beach, their bare feet kicking sand into the air behind them, rose to the front of Beth's mind. Delphine? She said.
Hurry up, Beth,
Eveline said, her voice tugging Beth back to the present.
You'll have time for old friends later.
She continued along the corridor, Beth hurrying behind her, and turned beneath the archway at the far end of the oval. The archway that was larger and prettier than all the others. Wait, Beth said, her footsteps slowing. Do you live here now? Eveline laughed.
No, I am not ruler. I have advanced a second, though, so who knows what might happen one day.
But should I not clean up before meeting with the ruler?
I am well aware that you're not properly dressed, but newcomers are required to report to the ruler's residence immediately upon entering our community.
She tugged the jacket off Beth, then waved her hand near Beth's legs and hands until the dirt and blood magically disappeared.
There. You look a little more acceptable now.
Eveline turned to face the ruler's residence, which was covered in leafy green vines.
Don't dawdle, Beth. Our ruler doesn't like to be kept waiting.
Beth's meeting with the ruler, a woman named Lillian who was guarded by Amazon warrior-type women and who seemed vaguely familiar, was brief. Lillian walked around her as Eveline spoke. She sniffed at the air, touched Beth's rain-dampened hair, and then congratulated Eveline on the return of her daughter. It was odd and creepy, and Beth hardly breathed until she was out of the house. She wasn't the leader when I was a child, Beth said when they reached the corridor.
No, she was elected 3 years ago.
Other than that, Eveline offered no further explanation. There were more women here now, young and old, all of them beautiful and all of them watching her. No men, of course. Siren men lived separately. They were necessary for continuing the siren race, but energy and power could not be drawn from them, which meant they were otherwise useless to siren women. Eveline turned beneath another archway, and when they entered the small house, Eveline said, "Welcome home, my daughter." She led Beth into the sitting room, which was just as white and bright as the marble outside. I have only one bedroom, so you'll need to sleep in here until we can convert my study into a room for you. Or add on a separate room. She tapped her chin. Yes, that would be better. Oh, don't sit on that until you've had a bath, she added quickly, as Beth hovered near the spotless white chaise lounge. Come, the bathing pool is this way. As Beth soaked in a pool of steaming water, her mother sat on the stool beside the tall mirror in the corner of the room and brushed her lustrous hair. We have much to do, she said. You'll need to learn more about control, and there are plenty of other lessons to catch up on. History and politics and the like, and of course, we should have a celebration, a party to welcome you home. To someone like Beth, who'd never been comfortable as the center of attention, that sounded like an awful idea. Okay, she said, as she moved to the edge of the pool. Does it take long to learn control? It can take several months for a child, but since you're much older, I hope you find control easier to grasp. Then again, she lowered her brush. Nothing about your magical development has been normal, so I can't say how long it will take you to achieve control.
Beth nodded, trying not to feel daunted by everything she still had to learn.
It felt as though my magic appeared out of nowhere, but now that I think about it, I remember strange things happening sometimes when I was younger. She took a breath before continuing, telling herself that this was her mother and that she shouldn't be afraid to speak more than a few words to her. I fought with Dad once. I was angrier than I'd ever been, and even though I was scared of shouting at him, I couldn't help it. I screamed all my anger out and then ran upstairs. When I got to my bedroom, I found that all my books and papers had blown off my desk and scattered onto the floor. The window was open, and I told myself it must have been a particularly strong gust of wind. But I remember thinking how strange it was, because it hadn't been windy at all that day.
"Mm-hmm,"
Eveline murmured. She was once again brushing her hair, and Beth couldn't tell if she was listening or not. She decided to continue anyway. Another time at school, a friend passed me a joke on a piece of paper. It was so funny, but I wasn't supposed to laugh because we were in the middle of a lesson, so I did my absolute best to hold my giggles in. That's when the tap in the basin at the back of the classroom popped off and sprayed water everywhere. The teacher thought it was a plumbing issue, but maybe it was me. There were other strange things that happened, but I never put them all together and thought of myself as the cause of any of them, not until now.
"I see,"
Eveline said, sounding almost bored. Beth climbed out of the pool and reached for the white robe Eveline had hung behind the door for her. She pulled it on and asked, "Do you think all those incidents were caused by my magic trying to get out?"
"Possibly."
Eveline stood and examined her appearance in the mirror.
"Interesting that your father didn't notice any of this."
"Yeah," Beth said quietly, but she knew why. Her father didn't notice much when it came to her. Well, except for last night when she'd come downstairs in the red dress. He'd taken notice then. And now, as she caught a glimpse of both her mother and herself in the mirror's reflection, she suddenly understood why. Her father had looked at her and seen Eveline, and he'd hated her for it. Chapter 4. It was intimidating as hell, standing before a crowd of stunningly beautiful women. Beth knew their intense beauty was only part of their siren magic, yet the thought did nothing to ease her insecurity. She wondered if her sudden awakening of magic had affected her own appearance. Once she'd cleaned up, her mother had commented on how enchantingly lovely she looked. Possibly the nicest thing Eveline had ever said to her. But when Beth looked in the mirror, she couldn't see any difference. The difference, if there was one, must be a kind of glamour, visible only to others and not to herself. She reminded herself that she belonged here now, as her tentative steps took her out from beneath the stone archway and onto the sand near the shimmering pool of water. She'd chosen a dress far less revealing than the one she'd worn to her disastrous date with Jack. The blue skirt was long and flowing, tickling her bare feet and skimming the sand behind her. The sleeves were a modest length, ending just above her elbows, but the neckline plunged a little more than she was comfortable with. It was one thing to bare her cleavage to the guy she loved, and quite another to put it on display before a group of women with assets far more enticing than her own. Feeling utterly naked, she wrapped her arms around herself and waited. Conversation stilled and every eye turned to her. She forced herself to look away from the examining gazes, focusing instead on the glittering rocks, the tiny lights floating in the air, and the music emanating faintly from somewhere behind her. Eveline, who'd walked out of the tunnel at Beth's side, lifted her hand and laid it lightly on Beth's lower back as she began speaking. In tones as mesmerizing as any master storyteller's, she presented Beth to the siren community, spinning a heartwarming tale of homecoming and reunion. Beth noted that her previous lack of magic and forced exile from the community at an early age were never mentioned. Eveline finished her story by encouraging everyone to make Beth feel welcome. The chattering started up once more, the music grew louder, and Beth felt her mother's hand pressing against her back, urging her forward. She took a few hesitant steps, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. She knew people were still looking at her, still talking about her. Was she meant to approach someone and just begin a conversation? Or wait for someone to walk up to her? This was awful. It was worse than the first day at a new school. She was contemplating hiding behind a rock when she noticed someone coming toward her. Delphine, moving with gliding grace, her glorious copper curls tumbling over her shoulders. She greeted Beth with a grin. "I can't believe you're back." She leaned in as if for a hug, but perhaps noticing the way Beth's arms tightened self-consciously around her chest, Delphine opted to rest her hand on Beth's upper arm instead, squeezing lightly before letting go. "I'm so happy you turned out to be magical after all. I was completely devastated after your mother sent you away. I cried myself to sleep every night for weeks." Beth allowed herself to relax into a smile. "I'm willing to bet I cried a whole lot more than you did." "Oh no, it must have been terrible. I've never even been into the human realm. Is it as boring as they say it is?" Beth shrugged. "It has its perks. Like Jack. Let him be okay," she pleaded silently. "Well, anyway," Delphine swung her arms at her sides. "Isn't it pretty out here tonight? We don't often have gatherings that involve the entire community." "It is lovely," Beth said, wanting to smack herself over the head for not being able to come up with anything more intelligent to say. "Do you remember how we used to sneak out here and watch the older girls training?" Delphine said, nodding toward the rocks on the other side of the pool. "I always thought it was so silly we had to practice the traditional arts, singing from the rocks to call the sailors. Don't we have better ways to draw men in these days?" Beth chuckled. "Don't let my mother hear you say that. I've been back a little more than a day, and I've already heard her practicing her singing." Delphine rolled her eyes. "Your mother? I shouldn't let my mother hear me say things like that. She'd remind me how inappropriate it is for the ruler's niece to oppose the way things are." "Oh, it's your aunt who's ruler now?" Beth said, as the connection clicked into place. "That's why I thought she looked familiar." "Yes. The previous ruler was killed just over 3 years ago. We still don't know what happened. Aunt Lillian was voted in, but not everyone wanted her as ruler. There was public disagreement and fighting. It was all a bit messy." She sighed. "You really do have a lot to catch up on, don't you?" Beth rolled her eyes. "Don't remind me. Here I am, 16 years old, and I have to do control lessons like a 5-year-old. Well, don't think about it now. Come, let's dance." Delphine grasped Beth's hand and tugged her toward the pool, where several women were twirling and giggling and splashing. Perhaps it was Delphine's willingness to include her that made Beth suddenly feel more confident than before. Whatever it was, she let Delphine lead her to the edge of the water. But then the copper-haired beauty slowed. She looked over her shoulder at Beth, an odd expression growing on her face. She frowned and raised her free hand to her forehead. "Delphine, what's wrong?" "I don't know." Delphine stood still, breathing slowly and purposefully, as if each breath caused her great effort. "I feel so faint." Abruptly, something changed. Pure, raw power, delicious and head-rushing and addictive, shot through Beth's body. Delphine's breaths became gasps. Her hand slipped out of Beth's. She stumbled a few steps backward, and then, amidst a rising chorus of screams, her limp body collapsed into the water.
How dare you? Her mother hissed. How dare you? Using energy-drawing magic against another siren? It shouldn't even be possible.
Is she okay? Beth asked, her shaking fingers pressed against her mouth. Please tell me she's okay.
She'll live,
Lillian stated, marching into Eveline's sitting room.
Explain yourself, she directed at Beth. How did you do that?
I just touched her. I didn't plan it just happened.
Lies, Eveline spat. That isn't how our power works. Even you know that. You'd been taught the basic laws of magic by the time you left here.
Beth did know that. She knew exactly how siren magic worked, which was why she'd wanted to point out to Zoe that eating men had nothing to do with the way sirens obtained their energy. But she thought back over the past day, remembering each person she'd encountered, and realized it wasn't a lie. When Eveline hugged her on the beach yesterday, she'd touched Beth's jacket, not her skin. Jack's jacket, a voice reminded her silently, but she pushed the thought away. Lillian had touched her hair last night, and this evening, Eveline's hand had rested against Beth's back, where the soft blue fabric covered her skin. And finally, when Delphine had greeted her, she'd touched Beth's sleeve. It was only when Delphine took her hand and pulled her to the water that everything had gone wrong. I'm not lying. Beth wrapped her arms around herself as she began shivering, from cold or shock, or both. Delphine was the first person to touch my bare skin since I arrived here. That must be how it
doesn't work that way,
Eveline snapped.
It's easy enough to test, Lillian said. Bring another girl in, and stop that ridiculous shivering.
She grabbed a shawl from the Shea lounge and threw it at Beth, who drew it quickly around her shoulders. 2 of Lillian's guards must have been just outside the room awaiting orders, because they appeared less than a minute later, leading a scared young girl between them.
Touch her,
Lillian commanded. What? Beth recoiled. No, I don't want to hurt. But Lillian grasped the girl's hand, raised it, and pressed it against Beth's cheek. For a moment, nothing happened, and Beth almost laughed out loud in relief. But then, the girl's eyelids fluttered and her breathing became shallower. She staggered and fell to her knees. The guards came forward and dragged the terrified, gasping girl from the room.
What is wrong with you, Beth? Eveline demanded. Turn it off.
I can't.
Of course you can turn it off. You're a siren. You choose when to exert your influence or power over someone else.
But how?
By simply willing it. Goodness, Beth, it's not that hard. This is instinct, not something that requires training. You touch a man and you either want his energy or you don't. It's as easy as that to switch it on and off. You're missing the point, Eveline, Lillian said quietly. She should not be able to draw power from any female. That is of far greater concern than her inability to control her power.
It hadn't exactly escaped my notice, Eveline muttered, pacing between Lillian and Beth. Lillian clasped her hands together.
Let us not forget that she is a halfling. Their magic, if they have any, can often manifest in unusual ways.
Unpredictable, Eveline growled. That's the word everyone likes to use. Lillian sighed.
I hate that word.
Eveline surveyed her daughter, then reached for her.
Take my hand. This time, tell yourself that you don't want to draw any energy. Remind yourself that you are satisfied in this moment with what you have. It's as easy as that. Beth slowly shook her head. I don't think that will help. I never wanted to take anyone's power, so how will telling myself not to want it make any difference? Eveline made an annoyed sound at the back of her throat. Perhaps you subconsciously wanted their energy. You are half siren after all, and my daughter. The desire for power should be strong within you. Lillian's stern gaze flicked toward Eveline, and her eyebrows pinched together slightly. Beth wondered briefly what subtext she was missing between the two women, but now was not the time to ponder the possible power struggles within the siren community. Beth focused on her mother and her outstretched hand. I don't want to hurt you, Mom. It was the first time she'd used the word in almost 10 years, and she hoped it might have a softening effect upon Eveline. After all, the woman was offering to end up in a gasping heap, just to help Beth get this horrible life-sucking ability under control. Surely that meant she cared, even if just a little bit. Eveline's expression remained stony. I told you to take my hand. It was an order, not a suggestion. Pushing aside the hurt Eveline's words caused her, Beth focused on Jack instead. I never wanted to hurt him. I never wanted his energy. I'm content with whatever power resides within my own body. Then she took her mother's hand. There was no delay this time. Life-giving energy flooded Beth's body. Eveline tore her hand from Beth's grasp. She stumbled backward and caught herself against the wall as she breathed slowly and heavily, one hand pressed to her chest. Her gaze, horrified and cold, slowly rose until it locked on Beth's. I told you to turn it off. I can't, Beth wailed. I don't know what this is. I don't know how to stop it. So, Lillian said, her tone sounding final. She can draw energy from anyone, and she has no control over it. She's dangerous. Clearly, she can't stay here. But Beth turned to Eveline, but found her mother's expression as harsh as Lillian's. You're saying I'll never be able to control this? It should be easy, Beth, Eveline said. If it isn't easy, then your magic isn't like ours, and we can't help you. And obviously you can't stay here, she added. You need to leave. As pain swelled in her chest, Beth imagined the cracks spreading across her heart. Cracks formed by her father and now deepened by her mother. But where will I go? That isn't our concern. Return to your father. Go off on your own. It doesn't bother me as long as... Eveline's final words were lost as Beth turned and raced out of the house. Tears blinded her as she ran across the corridor and into the oval garden. She should have never come back here. Of course she wasn't welcome. Of course she didn't belong. And now, thanks to the sudden awakening of her deadly power, she didn't belong in the human realm either. She was... A figure stepped out from behind a fountain, and Beth nearly smacked right into the girl she'd almost killed. Delphine! She gasped, taking a few hurried steps backward. I'm so glad you're okay. What did you do? Delphine asked. I don't know. Beth continued backing up as Delphine moved with feline-like grace toward her. She expected anger, outrage, but the girl seemed almost fascinated. A slow smile curled her lips upward, sending a chill slithering down Beth's spine. That smile was somehow more dangerous than anger. I can't control it, Beth explained quickly. It happens whenever I touch anyone, man or woman. Delphine slowly advanced on her, like a cat preparing to pounce. Beth turned to run, but found a bench behind her. She swung back around, clutching the ring on her left forefinger, The ring that had brought her here. If she turned it now, would it take her back to the human realm? She twisted it. 1, Delphine raised her hands. 2, and pushed a flash of blue light at her. 3. And in a glittering, spinning swirl of magic, she was sucked out of time and space and thrown into darkness.